let's get it started. Okay, a key theme about this thing is, again, as I mentioned, and we also mentioned, right, in today's evolving healthcare landscape, it's evident that collaborative healthcare ecosystem is very important to drive innovation forward, right? So the recent launch of, as I mentioned, the Healthcare Industry Transformation Map 2025 by the MOH Singapore actually highlights the importance of strengthening and moving beyond just the traditional ecosystem of collaboration into research institutions, into universities, and even the startups, right? So this panel discussion brings about the thought leadership from different areas, as you can see, right, to share about their experience, their expectations of what we can expect in the ecosystem innovation collaboration. Yeah. Okay. So first question to Wei Yang, right? Just now in your keynote, you need to on the mic later. Yeah, in your keynote, right, you mentioned about various forms of future health, from population to precision health, and then the different omics, right? And then the MDocs and even the metaverse, right? So how does this, I mean, you mentioned that this also bring values in your last life cycle slide, right? Bring values in the clinical outcomes and cost effectiveness. So there are so many things to do, right? Although there are 3 bubbles only, but 3 times 5 slides or 4 slides, you have 12 to 15 bubbles. So what are the priorities? How should we be focusing on, right? As I mentioned already, someone said, right? Someone said there are many pilots, more pilots in healthcare industry than aviation industry. So how do we actually prioritize, and what should we be focusing on?
Thanks, Jim. So I was thinking about the pilot statement, and maybe the way to think about this is this. Airlines are actually one of the most profitable companies. And the reason why they are is because they actually manage to organize the pilots such that you know exactly where they're going. And more importantly, there's a different pilot for a different time so that you have multiple flights to the same location. But it adds value only because it's organized. And hence, the first thing I want to say is that you may have a product, you may think your product is great and is worth beating. But maybe there is room for more than one product. And that when you can demonstrate your product against other products, and you'll likely find that in certain patient groups, your product may be less superior, but there may be others where it is more superior. Now, if you can imagine a situation, I have 4 or 5 pilots that's tried out on the entire population. At the end of it, I might still have 5 different devices or therapeutics, which are effective for 5 different groups of people. So don't see competition as necessarily a bad thing. Competition helps to validate the value of what you have. And more importantly, pilots which are well organized can be like SIA and very valuable to the system. The second thing I want to say is that it sounds like a lot of things to do, which is why when you ask me to speak, I'm happy to speak to an audience like this. Because if we all go and do one part of it, there is some hope. And more importantly, if we coordinate what we do and understand the roles of each of us and how we contribute to each other, then that whole system can be built. It wouldn't happen overnight, but 5 years, 10 years from now, I think we will have something that actually really works. But it does require all of us to understand where we think we're all going. And of course, to also have a confidence and I would say courage to ask ourselves, hey, the vision we had, is it still valid? Is it changing? And maybe, some of these ongoing discussions that highlight a new technology that might fundamentally change the way we think about what the future might look like. We need to talk about it. But if not, maybe that's where we are getting to. After you figure out how the system might work in collaboration, the question is, how do you ensure that the design of incentives are actually going to keep all of us in alignment? Because I can build something and draw something nice, but in the end, if when I stand in my company's shoes and look at the thing and say, okay, if everyone is doing this, I do something slightly different, I'm going to benefit, then the whole thing's going to fall apart. Okay. I'm a PhD in economics, so I'll borrow from economics. There's this idea of a repeated game. In a once-off game, you're a prisoner's dilemma. Right? Someone will say, oh, I'll be the one who's smart and then double-cross the other guy, and the other guy will lose and I'll gain more. But if you do it once, the other guy is going to double-cross you the next time around, then we all lose out. Now, if we actually say, no, this is an ecosystem, we are all in this, and we all continue to build for this ecosystem. And if today I double cross you, tomorrow no one in the ecosystem will speak to me, then you have a way of saying incentives can be aligned. So I think some of these things are things we need to think through. It's not straightforward, but I feel that if I do some of these things, I don't need to answer a difficult question of what to do first. But I think more importantly, each one of us have a part to do. So when I was in the Ministry of Health, Eric would know, I drove very hard the architectural aspects of what we're trying to achieve. The data sort of consistency, and even trying to say, let's have one platform rather than multiple platforms, because otherwise I can't figure out what's going on. Of course, Eric was like, I need to move. I said, no, can you? But if you keep the larger thing in mind, then maybe there's a reason for doing some of these things, and that larger reason is ultimately going to be of greater benefit to all of us. And that's how we need to think.
Thank you, Wei Yang. Yeah. So definitely, I think that tallies and echo the main theme today very well, right? Ecosystem. And later on, we can come back to how do you think that each players, what kind of roles they can play. But maybe I move on to Eric first. Hospital, right? Healthcare group. Basically, you are like the bee. Everybody want to come close to you guys, right? So maybe you will be the one defining what is the role of different ecosystem player. But I mean, as I mentioned in my part, right, just now, I talked to a lot of MedTech and pharma companies recently. And one of the feedback I always get is that it's very difficult to work with hospital, right? Expensive, right? Before we even talk about the details, expensive. Long waiting time, right? Just like patient long waiting time, although it improved already, right? So, I mean, what are you really looking for? I mean, we do hear of successful cases as well, right? Some startups told me that because of the innovation they bring, so actually it moved very fast, right? So what are you really looking for, whether from the MedTech, pharma companies or the startup, that you will actually collaborate with them more, right? And then they will have shorter waiting time, pay less, and can still bring benefit to you. Yeah.
Okay, so like in my email to you, this is actually a very insightful but yet difficult questions. I prepared some answer, but I'm actually going to throw them away. So I mean, if I sound a bit chaotic, please pardon me. I was actually been thinking, the definition of ecosystem, and I just want to actually go and first open that. Number one, we don't intentionally try to be difficult to work with. Okay, and to a certain extent. And the reason, one thing Jim forgot to introduce me is actually, I'm actually also a practicing emergency physician in the emergency department in Northern. And the reason why I actually bring this up is that you always wonder how come, you have a doctor to actually go into IT. Although I don't know, I mean, which one have actually a better pay salary at this moment. But having said that, this is actually in fact underpin one of the difficulties we have in healthcare. We always have within the ministry, we already actually have two sayings. In terms of money spent, we compete with MINDEF and see who gets number one. In terms of regulation, we compete with MAS and to see who's actually number one. and actually it summarized the problem quite nicely. Despite the amount of fundings that we have, healthcare ultimately is a very, very heavily regulated industry. And I think that's actually in fact for very good reasons, because we are not dealing with money, we are not dealing with delay time, we are ultimately dealing with human life. And human life is impossible for you to actually go and put the price tag for it. And so therefore, I mean, and to be honest, it's actually not just a problem with a collaboration between the private and public entities, or MedTech or pharma with a government hospital. Even within internally, when we actually go and try to drive innovations, and I'm just being very candid here, we have a lot of problems. We have humongous problems. It's actually not so much of whether this thing is good, and to a certain extent, things are good. But I think Wei Yang have actually touched on a very important point, is ultimately what does it mean? And I think that's actually in fact a key question that we actually always need to answer. And what does it mean can actually go and be unpacked in a few layers. First of all, I cannot have something that's actually worse off. I think in medical terms, we actually have something called a gold standard. That means that is actually in fact the standard of practice you need to give, and that's actually in fact the minimum quality that we need to actually go and be able to deliver our patients. So when you actually go and comes in, you need to understand what is actually in fact the minimum quality that we're actually in fact looking at. And medicine have actually evolved since, we are actually cavemen and things like that. So imagine all the different knowledge as well as, permutations you have actually in fact put in. So that is actually in fact a very important benchmark to actually go and think more of. Secondly, I just want to also put it up front is that ultimately, what does it mean? Need to actually go and have a certain impact. Proving it as good is actually not just good enough. You need to actually go and tell me exactly how does it actually go and make our life easier. And to a certain extent to actually go and help us care for our patients better. And that actually go and permeates to actually go and different things. It's actually not so much of whether this product by itself is actually good enough, whether this product within the ecology, in fact, is actually going to be good enough. I just give you a very, very simple example, and if the audience can indulge me. A few years ago, we tried to actually go and replace our meal ordering system in the hospital into the EMR. So I think all of us order meals, grab food and things like that before. Simple enough, right? Click, 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 pay, that's it. But when we actually go and do this, we realize there's so many integrations that's actually required. So a simple meal ordering system requires at least integration to a lab system, integration to our pharmacy system, integration to our EMR, in particular the nursing systems, our billing system, and so on and so forth. And each of them have a good reasons. Because you really understand patients that is actually in the hospital, when they are actually in fact sick, they are actually on extreme conditions. So the reason why we need to integrate the lab system is in case the patient was actually in fact found to have low blood sugar. You cannot actually go and keep them on the low blood sugar meal because they are diabetic and therefore continue or else their blood sugar will just crash. On the other hand, patients with renal failure, if they're actually on certain drugs, they cannot be given certain things. So I think it all underpins on the whole understanding of the ecology. And ultimately, I think to just summarize what I'm actually trying to say, what does it mean we actually need the third dimension, which is understanding that certain things we are actually in fact very, very upcoming to change. But certain things are, in fact, because of policy, because of cybersecurity, because of way of practice, because of no worse off, there are something that it's actually going to be very difficult. So having that understanding and working together with the particular institutions or cluster to actually go and get those things up, in fact, I think it's actually probably important. And to a certain extent, I have actually, in fact, been seeing those successful innovation projects have actually, in fact, gotten very good at that. And those that are actually, in fact, not so good have actually been, in fact, failed in some of this area. I think last but not least, I just want to actually go and touch a bit on what we are looking for, because that was actually, in fact, in your original questions. Ultimately, I think healthcare lags behind the larger industries on how we actually been pushing innovations. And so, like what you have actually mentioned, over the past years, at least in Singapore, we have actually been pushing a lot of platforms so we can actually go and settle the mundane things like data security, cybersecurity, policy, and things like that. Definitely for any of the audience who are actually interested to collaborate with us, do come to us. Yeah, but ultimately, I think once we actually can, but please come with the understanding that we are still at a bit of an infancy stage of setting up these things up. So if we can actually go and co-innovate, I think that would actually be the best way to do it now at this moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. I think you become the honey because, by the way, Zoka is designing electronic meal ordering system now. So my architect there can talk to you later. Okay, but yeah, I think one of the key things that I resonate with you is that when I talk to the people who wants to get into healthcare IT, one of the things I told them is that because I myself got into healthcare like 5-6 years ago from telco world, so being very advanced in technology, I told them that when I get into healthcare, first thing I learned is not about whether you're the most advanced technology or not, it's whether you know what is patient safety before you even want to do anything. Yeah, I think that's one thing very different in the healthcare industry. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So maybe Kenneth, right? You hear from the government perspective, from the hospital perspective, right? Can you share from your experience from a MedTech company's perspective, right? How do you think ecosystem innovation is about? And I know that I read about your LinkedIn post and a blog, right? You share a lot about the network care, you share about infrastructure as a subscription, and I know you guys have a chain of hospital in India even, right? Just to make sure that you practice what you do, right? So can you share more about that as well?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just let me add some context to this also. By first of all sharing a little bit about what Varian does, right? we operate in this area of cancer care. And cancer care is a very good model because the ideal cancer care is actually multidisciplinary. For a patient to get best cancer care, it has to be multidisciplinary care, right? The treatments have to be multimodality. That means they have to be treated by drugs, they have to be treated by surgery, they have to be treated by radiation therapy, and even in terms of the diagnostics, right? It's multimodality, right? You've got CTs, you've got MRs, you've got blood tests, you've got companion diagnostics. So it's a very good model of what we call breaking down silos and interoperability. Now, as Varian became part of Siemens, these concepts of digitalization that you talk about AI, you talk about big data, right? All that is not in the future for us. These are already in the innovations that we bring to the market, and they are core. And a lot of them are delivered via cloud. So that adds context to this also. Now, this is the present. But what we are trying to build for the future, Varian as part of Siemens Healthineers, and I think Jimmy talked a little bit about this, is the patient twin. If we are able to create a world whereby every patient has a twin, and that twin is populated by this vast data that's out there, then we can make better decisions. I think that's the vision that we are trying to build, right? So that sets context for this. Now, I love this word aligned that I keep hearing. And what I feel is for this healthcare ecosystem to thrive, it is very important for us, every single entity, every single player, to have an aligned interest. It has aligned interest, aligned purpose, then you get aligned incentives. So I think that's probably where it comes from. The other thing that is also important is there's a need for the ecosystem to share the burden and also distribute the capacity, right? Now, on top of these three, the future of this ecosystem definitely has to be digitally enabled. We have to accept that, right? Which means the need for every single entity to build that digital capability, and also very importantly, the cybersecurity competence, not the policy. The policy and the competence is very different. Competence determines how you respond to an attack. The policy doesn't determine how you respond to the attack, right? So the competence is the one that reduces the fear and increases that trust that you talked about. Now, so this is the ideal ecosystem, correct? Now, what you then see are, there are a lot more conflicts of interest than there are aligned, but there are aligned interests. And where do the aligned interests come from? The aligned interest comes from every single player wants productivity. They want faster, cheaper, right? So that's the aligned interest. I'm not sure whether anyone wants more expensive and slower. Nobody wants that, right? Now, what else? Everyone in the system wants improved clinical outcomes. I don't think anyone wants worse clinical outcomes. And everyone wants greater access. Patients have got less waiting time, greater access to infrastructure or care. Now, any player in this entire ecosystem that doesn't add value is going to be squeezed out. And I think that's the reality that we are all going to face, right? Now, as we then begin to accelerate into this digitally enabled space, we are then all going to have to invest money. And where are we all going to invest? We're going to invest more in infrastructure. I think across, not just in Singapore, across this region, healthcare infrastructure is insufficient. Governments are just going to have to invest more, right? Where do they get the money from? That's a totally different question, right? You're going to invest more in infrastructure. You're going to invest more in human capital. You need more people. But you can make them more efficient by investing in some digital capabilities to make them more efficient. And all these investments are going to be needed. If you don't invest, the ecosystem is not going to thrive. Now, that's probably where we go into the model, right? Because when you talk about investment, investments need money. Whether it's a private investment, whether it's government, it is going to need money. And money means capex. And every year you ask for budgets. Now, one of those ways to just speed up and make this ecosystem grow faster, thrive, is this slightly different models that we can work with. One of them is, I think, infrastructure as a subscription. So imagine if you're a hospital, you're going to have to invest in infrastructure, you're going to have to invest in human capital, you're going to have to invest in digital capabilities, you're going to ask for a budget. And that budget sometimes doesn't come. How do you speed it up? Infrastructure as a subscription becomes a possibility. And we do that in Varian, right? That means we do go to care providers and say, hey, you want to build a cancer center? Yes, right? You need radiotherapy machines, you need a CT, you need an MR. Now, the innovative models come in different forms of financing. That means we can place that equipment and we share that, financing burden, right? It can be a pay-per-use model, it can be a pay-per-patient model, it can be deferred payment models. That allows infrastructure to grow quicker, technology to be adopted a lot quicker. But we all know that healthcare is not just about having the machine or having the beds, right? It's also about having the right people. And not just having people, having good knowledge, well-trained people. And that takes time, right? And the way to do that sometimes, of course, is to just make the deployment of the people more effective. And there comes in that network care. Now, in the oncology space, if you look across the world, there are already many existing models where private groups are able to deploy networks in a hub and spoke model across countries, sometimes across borders, right? But of course, hub and spokes have to be connected in the backbone digitally for them to deliver this. Now, what a hub and spoke model does is a hub and spoke model is able to then deliver that distributed capacity, right? Share the burden across the entire network. I think today you cannot move patients from one cluster in Singapore to another cluster, correct? Can, but not easy, right? Yeah. So
Trying to.
yeah. So I think the ideal world is this, whereby you can actually share that capacity, right? And there are examples already. Hub and spoke models are able to do that. Now, the hub and spoke model then goes into a deeper piece called care as a service. Because you can have hub and spoke, but you need the right people. And the knowledge can reside in the hub. And that knowledge today doesn't necessarily has to be provided by the care provider. Varian, as an equipment provider, we are also then able to provide to our oncology customers treatment planning as a service. Because if you look at oncology, treatment planning is the most time consuming, the most knowledge dependent, the most skill dependent service. But if you go to a country like Myanmar, you may not have that capability. That can be delivered outside the country. And not only can it be delivered outside the country, we are able to then augment it in the back end with our digital capabilities. Right? So to just put things in summary, infrastructure as a service, infrastructure as a subscription means converting CapEx into OpEx to make it more easily digestible by the healthcare system, right? Network care means, keeping the knowledge, to being able to distribute that knowledge evenly and the standard of care evenly across the entire network. And care as a service means being able to outsource that care from the care provider to sometimes the MedTech companies, and then to augment that with some form of digital capability. So I hope that gives some context to the what the evolution of this ecosystem can be.
Thanks, Kenneth. Yeah, I really like your different new business model, which is also what we are putting on our white paper as well, right? And I think one key thing that I learned from your infrastructure as a service or subscription is that when I talk to many developing countries, hospitals, they really like it because they cannot afford a big capex, okay? But when I talk to the more developed countries, hospitals, some of them say, I don't really need that, okay? I have enough capex, I want to own it. Yeah, but what we also realize that slowly, they also recognize that it's not just about the capex investment, it's also about your subsequent corresponding patches, whether it is security patches, your predictive maintenance, and many other things that actually has a benefit of going into that model, right? So we can discuss more about that. Let me move on to Prof. Sir. Right, so Prof, you are both academic, as we introduced you just now, and also startup co-founder, many startups actually, right? So, and one thing that I hear from you over our lunch and dinner, sorry to say that, is that you say actually Singapore hospital not easy to work with, expensive and slow to some extent, but you're actually getting a lot of good tractions in Indonesia and even in UK and other places. So how do you compare the similarities and differences, right? Doing so many different trials across different countries.
Yeah, don't remember saying that it's hard to work with the Singapore hospital. There are some difficulties, but let me give a more complete picture as to my working experience with the local hospitals and versus that with the Indonesia hospital. But before that, maybe I want to talk about the differences in terms of conducting clinical trials when I was a faculty member in the university versus when I later on became a MedTech startup CEO. The difference, I think, mainly is what Wei-Yang has mentioned, the mind and culture. In the university, money was not an issue. Both sides will always contribute in kind because doctors, when they put in time and money, it's actually an opportunity cost involved. So it's the case for professors and the researchers. So money was never an issue. Duration, if the project lasts 2 to 3 years, normal. 1 year, too short. But when you go to the industry, 1 year, that's too long. So it's a question of mindset and culture, like you say. You know, when you're in a university context, you think quite differently compared to when you go to the industry. There's no right or wrong. It's just, at the point of time, your focus and your thinking are different. Now back to the issue of collaborating with the hospitals in Singapore versus that in Indonesia in terms of clinical trials. I would like to sort of discuss this from 3 angles. Firstly, the people and institution. Right, in Singapore, we actually collaborate I actually have collaborated with all the 3 clusters, right? SingHealth, NUH, NHG. And in Indonesia, I collaborated with 2 big hospitals. One is the Primaya, which is a hospital group that has like 15, 16 hospitals. The other, probably the 4th largest private hospital in Indonesia. The other one is a cardiology center in Indonesia. So from what I've said, you probably noticed that one major difference is in Singapore, to me, it is actually easier to collaborate with a restructured hospital than the private hospital. And it's easy to understand because private hospital focus a lot more on the bottom line, the P&L. So when you're doing a trial, you're actually not making money. Whereas in Indonesia, you notice that the hospitals that I work with, they are actually private hospitals. And the reason is probably because the public hospital over there have no time for you. They're just too busy. They really have a shortage of manpower in terms of doctors, nurses, facilities, and so on. So that's one difference in terms of people. On the other hand, in terms of participating patients, or maybe I should say human subjects, because some of them are not patients, it's actually a lot faster, a lot more in Indonesia than in Singapore. I think that's not difficult to understand because for example, this hospital I work with, they have 16 hospitals located all over Indonesia, and they have a lot of patients going into the hospital every day. So for us, in order for us to get samples, in order for us to work together with the patients, it's a lot easier, a lot faster when we working with the Indonesian private hospitals, even private hospitals. Singapore, we always have to wait. My clinical partner will tell me, I'm not sure whether we have any patient this month. In Indonesia, I'm not sure whether we have 3 or 4 patients today. So that makes a difference. And you can't help. I mean, this is the nature of the setup in Singapore as well as in Indonesia. This is one of the things that I say it is also hard to work with the local hospitals. And so this is on people and institution. The second factor that I think I would like to discuss on the differences and the similarities is the process. Process will involve a few things. One of them, as I said before, is funding. In Singapore, I think so far, some of the hospital partners that I work with, including NHG, we were able to go around this problem because the PI himself said he will use his internal funding to fund this. But I actually have come across with some other restructured hospital who demanded me to pay 1 million Singapore dollars. As a new startup, my total funding is 1 million. So if we do a trial paying $1 million, I don't know how we're going to survive from there. So it's just impossible. So I have good and bad experience in Singapore hospitals. The second part about this, of course, is all the paperwork. It's a lot more rigorous. It's a more rigorous process in Singapore compared to in Indonesia. In Singapore, it took us 6 months to a year maybe to sort of finalize a collaboration agreement and then sign the agreement. Indonesia, 2-3 months. There's no comparisons here because I think you're talking about a more rigorous, perhaps that comes with more red tape and more checks and balances. But to a startup company, it makes a big difference because if we have to start a trial only after 6 to 12 months in Singapore, we actually lose a lot of opportunity. I think in private sectors, I think really time really is money. You can't afford to spend so much time on paperwork, but yet you have to do that. In Indonesia, it's much faster. And the second part, of course, is all the standard professional practices, like getting IRB, the ethical clearance, like getting patients' consents, and setting up the protocol, writing out what are the inclusion criteria and what are the exclusion criteria, what kind of patients are we going to include or exclude. This is done, I think, professionally in both sides. I think all the doctors that we work with, be it Singapore or in Indonesia, they are all professionals. They will do it. So it's actually an enjoyment working with them on that, although it takes time to do as well. Then, of course, there's also a part on, I'm still talking about the process. There's still a part of getting the trial to continue and then also end with some conclusions. In Singapore, it is quite efficient. Indonesia is quite efficient as well, but in Singapore, because we have a lack of participants, usually it will take much longer to complete. So in terms of process, the duration, I think this is a negative point when we had to work in Singapore. My third factor is on facilities. Undoubtedly, Singapore's hospital facilities are much better compared to the Indonesia facilities. So there are more checks that can be done here. There are more modalities that we can go for. And so the results can be more convincing. So in general, we actually do the validation trial here. I mean, clinical trials, I had to first of all say that I'm only more experienced in terms of conducting clinical trials on monitoring or diagnostic products. I think trials for drug efficacy tests, trials for treatments are quite different. Right, for monitoring and diagnostic products, it is important that we are able to, doctors are able to label the product, the results. And to label the results, you have to have the facilities. You have to have the gold standard facilities, and you have to have enough of them. So in this angle, from this angle, Singapore actually can provide a more professional service compared to that in Indonesia. In other words, the table of labels that I get from Singapore has many more factors, and whereas the labels that I get from Indonesia is relatively fewer, right? They are catching up. I think they are getting better. So as I say, I will do the validation trial here. Validation trial is one whereby you check the accuracy of the device or the product itself. Right? But I will do the usability trial in Indonesia. Usability trial means how useful it is. That means the patient and the doctors actually bring the product into their ecosystem, into their normal life, normal working life or daily life. And then they use it. And then at the end of that, you will then check how useful it is. Is it useful at all? And how useful it is, and whether or not the addition of this product, as what Wei Yang said, will lead to more costs, or is it something that will replace something that you can comfortably live without? So this is a usability trial, which is actually a requirement for a medical grade product to be usable, to be allowed to sell. In Indonesia, we do this a lot. In Indonesia, I think the other thing that we can try, which we don't really can try here, is because the products that I developed happen to be for remote monitoring. In Singapore, the most remote place is probably in NTU. So if you want to see doctor, no sweat, right? Within 1 hour, you see a doctor. Indonesia, no, right? It can be that the patient has never seen his or her doctor for a long time. So you can imagine that in terms of this ability to try the usability trial, it is much more realistic. It's much more useful. You see more usefulness in Indonesia than in Singapore if you are talking about a remote monitoring type of device. So with these three factors, I think there are pros and cons, working with the local and the overseas hospitals.
Thanks. I hope my question didn't stop you from getting trials in Singapore next time. Okay, but I really like the usability and the clinical trial part. I mean, Singapore is known to be a golden standard in the region for clinical trials, and definitely Indonesia has a lot of people who are used to or trying new things, right? It's just I remember when we were doing a lot of AI in the past, people were saying that you can do AI in more developed countries, but actually one of the best test bed is in China, where you have the sheer volume of population to really help to drive that forward. Thanks for sharing. So before I kind of summarize it, right, we kind of started late. Before I summarize the thing, can I open to the floor? Anyone has question? We can only take maximum 2 questions. Anyone? You can direct at any of the panelists. Question? We have a shy audience or you are hungry? Sure. Yeah.
As I was sort of listening to this clinical trial, right, and I was looking at the title, it says Sustainable Ecosystem Innovation. So it's not just about today, right? So it's about introducing new innovation into the ecosystem for the future. And if it's an innovation, it's going to be something that has got no benchmark. And when you talk about clinical trials, what do you think is going to be needed? You know, I talk about digital therapeutics. You talk about software as a medical device. How do you do clinical trials for digital therapeutics and software as a medical device? I think that's the one piece. The other one, we talk about the ecosystem is driven by funding. it's not just about proving clinical viability, it's also about health economics. Do you think we are sophisticated enough in our health economics?
Yeah, and I guess so a few things to comment there. You notice that I actually have a title that says Senior Advisor to the Ministry of Health.
Health economics.
It was Health Economics. I was trained as an economist, and it was one area that even as I decided it was time for me to leave the ministry, I asked to keep and help. And of course, in my role now in the university, I have access to economists in the management university. I knew the people in South School of Public Health very well because of COVID. And of course, more recently, I've been acquainted with Eric as well as David Marcher in the Duke NUS, Eric Finkelstein. So I do believe we can bring together some of this expertise, but to organize it in such a way that we're able to look at some of these things at the systems level. Because as I look into the future, a lot of it is not just about what we do in the hospital. Those things easier to measure. Point of care, I compare one against the other. Actually, you just need to gather the right data. But how do I look at, I do diagnostics versus I wait for the guy to show up symptoms? How do I, look at the value of that? How do I look at maybe even this whole access, in much more rural areas? Because the other thing to realize is that maybe the digital therapeutic or digital product is not great, but 60% is better than 0% right now for many of these people. And is that actually still better or worse? But is there a pathway to get there? I think those are the kind of questions that we need to be able to answer. And I just want to latch on what Prof was saying as well, because I think in the end we need to think about not about Singapore or Indonesia, but how do I look at the entirety of that ecosystem such that some things I do in Singapore, some things I do in Indonesia, but in all these things there's a certain coherence and the way we do things such that every single piece of data we collect helps us to get closer to market access. And there might be different strategies of which market you access, when and for what purpose, for any given technology that we have, that we need to think through. One of the things I tell people to get them interested to contribute to the digital ecosystem we're trying to build so that we can deliver health in the community for the elderly. Why do we want to deliver health in the community for the elderly? Because one of the biggest problems I have is whenever my parents my dad, because he suffered a stroke, wants to see a doctor, I got to take leave, I got to bring them to the hospital, and then I wait, and then I'm very frustrated because I'm waiting there for hours, then I come back, and then he just sits at home, when the call is there, I dial in, and everyone dials in, he doesn't even bother to travel, right? As we talk about aging population, ambulatory problems is a huge issue. If we can solve that, but yet in a way that actually doesn't reduce the quality of care. And how do we do that? Because if we have vital signs monitoring, right now the doctor looks at my dad's single blood test and then says, okay, that makes a statement. If there are ways to monitor some of these things much more remotely, he doesn't really need to come in to see anything. But more importantly, he already has much better data than what he used to be able to do and actually can deliver. But while we built this for Singapore, for our aging population, this same backbone of technology that we built is what you're doing in India. Right? I'm going to places where I otherwise cannot deliver health, and actually I'm delivering health at a much more lower marginal cost to provision, but because I built the infrastructure and investment in a place that's more able to pay, that allows me to roll out this technology into places where people can't pay as much, but for which I can then actually help to give them a provision that's much better than what they've ever been able to get. And of course then, why do I do that? Because in that process, I further validate the models and the data that I've had to sharpen my provision back to the people who have paid the investment. So I think we need to think in that so the ecosystem may not just be all of us here, but how do I work with the people in the region? And some of you may be in the region. How do I harness what you have back to actually inform us? And then there's a symbiotic relationship to actually make this thing work. So I just wanted to make that point as well. Thanks.
Go ahead.
I think that was a good comment, and I actually wanted to give another comment. I'd like to hear, from the panel, maybe from the floor as well. We talk about empowering sustainable ecosystem innovation. My field, having worked in the university and also in the industry for a while, I feel that currently, first of all, health or MedTech is a multidisciplinary field. So it is very hard for you to close the door and then think that, I have this innovation. It's very hard for the doctor to think about that. It's very hard for even harder for engineer to think that, I have this innovation. It's like what Yang said, you have the innovation does it work? Does it help people and so on? You know? So I always hope that there is a more systematic way, right, to create innovation, to maintain innovation, and to review the innovations. And I always thought that it is difficult for the hospital to do this. It's difficult for industry to do this. Maybe it's the government's job, or maybe it's a forum like this that can be expanded into a marketplace where we can share ideas and we can share problems, and then we can look at we can form a demand's point of view, generate innovations. That's one, and then maybe form the innovation that have already been generated. Think about whether or not we can widen the applications. It's really like what you say, Yang. And then at the end of that, a lot of the times, at the end of the innovation, when it's used by the people, the conclusion, the review, are done only solely between the company maybe and the user themselves. But I think besides the end user, the patient, it's also important for the healthcare professional to come in and to say that, well, yeah, you had done this and my patients are happy about this or not happy about this, but this is what I think. So this end of innovation implementation review, I think is currently a little bit lacking. So if you ask me for a wish, I wish that we can have this kind of forum, something like this, or maybe taking a different form. Maybe it doesn't have to be physically here, but a forum whereby innovation can be created, can be maintained, can prosper. I don't know what you guys think.
No, I agree. So actually, I'll help you sell CHI. So there's a Center for Health Innovation and actually they're trying to do some correlation. But the reality is that actually the classes have a bit of an innovation center as well that's now beginning to try to do some of these things. And I just want all of you to understand as well that if indeed we collate some of these things and actually show you say you're a very good product, but I already have 4 products I'm trialing, that there are 2 responses you can get. You can say mine is better, or you can say, okay, I'm willing to subject myself to the same conditions for trial, and we can all see which is better or worse. But of course, the problem is that we don't have enough patients. Then how we then build an ecosystem that allows me to tap on patients in the region, maybe through players like Varian, who actually have that kind of network out there that we can also tap on. Because then those things become potential offerings that you can offer through your network as well. But then in the end, we benefit as a system to have a better sense of the evaluation. And of course, with trusted partners who we can trust, can deliver even overseas, I think that will actually only benefit us. But in the end, all these things, we need to figure out how to lie. We need to figure out how to actually make sure that the concerns of the clinicians can be met or can be answered. And one more to say as well, while clinical trials and so on, they are there for a reason, because there's a way that some of these drugs and so on were developed in the past. Now in the digital age, I mean, that's why HSA in the end will say, it's okay, let's just roll out the vaccine. Because I told them, I give you full access to electronic health records. You go and monitor, you go and search, you go and find any signs of any sort of SAE, because we can now do that. Last time we couldn't, right? So if we have that system, then the question is, how do you even begin to think, what does a clinical trial mean? Or is there a much larger dose of post-market surveillance that we subject ourselves to in exchange for a shorter period, or maybe in exchange for a different set of rules of how some of these things can be done? But of course, we need to work it out as an ecosystem. Both sides need to actually bend in a way to actually make it work. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, William. So maybe before I wrap up, I will also invite every speaker to kind of wrap up within a minute. Right? We don't have time to open the floor already. Sorry, my timekeeper is chasing me. So we have heard from Wei Yang, right? Priorities, right? How to really prioritize. It depends. You don't just look at priorities. You look at what are the different roles the ecosystem players should be playing, right? And then, of course, we hear from Eric a lot about the value it can bring. It's not that it's difficult to work with hospital, right? There are many people trying to work with them. What's the value it can bring, whether it's a MedTech company, pharma companies, or startups, right? Complementary, that's most important. And I think, Kenneth, you echo that as well, the value it can bring. They've introduced many different new revenue stream or business model as well, which I think is very innovative. And of course, Prof, you come out with key terms, right? Things like ecosystem is beyond Singapore, ecosystem even with Indonesia, right? Usability, clinical trials, different countries have different strength in that. And you even brought up a term called marketplace later on, which I'm sure AWS and Microsoft will be very happy, right? Because they're building marketplace, right? You'll hear from them in panel 2. So I think the title says future of health. We young share a lot about precision health, genomics, dogs, and many things. And of course, Kenneth also shared the future of health new business model. Then we talk about sustainability. I think that's the most important thing. If everybody is not collaborating and everybody trying to repeat what others are doing or conflicting, then you can't be having a sustainable ecosystem, right? And you don't even need to talk about innovation because Prof already said, work in university, you can wait 2-3 years, get a lot of money, but you come to a commercial world, that will never work, yeah? So maybe 1 minute each, don't mind, summarizing how should the people be kind of prioritizing and what are the key things that you think, 1 or 2 things that's most important to ensure sustainable innovation in an ecosystem to the future of health?
I guess maybe one thing I'll ask everyone, since you're all in this space, obviously for innovation, if you have a very good idea, you think you have a very good product, ask yourself why someone else doesn't yet have it. Is it because you haven't figured out who else is actually doing this thing? Try and hunt them down, try and figure out how you can collaborate or how you can actually understand the competitiveness of what you're doing. And in that process, I think the likelihood of success would actually increase multifold. Maybe that's what I'll say.
Thanks, William. Eric?
Yeah. So for me, two things. Innovation is actually a process, right? It's not a work. It's in fact it's an ongoing problem-solving process. So understanding and knowing 2 things. What is actually in fact your underlying problem statement? That's actually in fact the things that you want to solve, and what is actually in fact the value, or to a certain extent, what is actually the true north that you're actually in fact aiming for. It's actually very important. Second point, I just want to bring it. I don't think we actually going to touch a bit on the future of health that much today. But actually, if you actually go and think about it, the future of health, while there are actually in fact a lot of interpretations, and depending on whether you're in Malaysia or Singapore, you may actually have different stages. But ultimately, it's actually about how we actually go and empower and help the patients or the residents to actually go and be able to actually go and go through the whole entire health journeys, right? So I think to a certain extent, in different stage, the technology or the digital means will actually go and definitely play a part. But we cannot expect within different cohorts, there's actually always going to be a one-size-fits-all solutions. So I think the customizability, the ability to actually go and build on a resilient platform, and the scalability in facilities and the flexibility is actually very, very important as we actually go through this journey. So I think that's actually just some thoughts I want to leave to everyone here.
Thanks. Yeah, I like the innovation is a process. A lot of people think innovation is tomorrow I wake up with a new idea, then there's innovation. Yeah. Okay, Kenneth?
Short statements and 2 strategic questions to ask. One, I would say for this ecosystem to thrive, trust has to be built. Fear has to be eliminated. I think there's a lot of fear. And then silos have to be broken, right? I think for that to thrive. The other one is, as we begin to deliver more innovations, and these innovations are non-traditional, they are novel, they are probably going to be digital. How do these innovations not just demonstrate clinical value, which I think we have all figured out a little bit better, but how do we make them demonstrate more economic value? Which I think if we are able to bring those capabilities, then these innovations will be adopted faster. Because very often the clinicians understand the impact, the payers will take a long time. If you think clinical trials take 5 years, it will take another 5 years for the payers to finally realize, oh, it makes a difference. So the economics piece is going to be important. Then the 2 questions I ask is, as we become more digital as an ecosystem, we need digital natives. I've always asked this question: has medical training become more digital? Has it kept pace? I'm not sure. That's a question I'm in search, and maybe offline we can talk a little bit. You can share with me. I haven't answered that question. And the last one is a more strategic question for everyone to ponder about: who owns the patient data? So I'll leave it at that.
I have 3 don'ts. Don't stop thinking. Don't stop learning. Don't give up when you are rejected. I think that will keep the momentum of the innovation going. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So with that, we kind of end our first panel discussion. Thanks to all the distinguished panelists.